Chapter 17, Part 2 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Part 2 of Chapter 17. And the 15th of October came. It had dragged for weeks, and then at the end it galloped. By that time Fanny had got used to seeing Theodore's picture and name outside Orchestra Hall, and in the musical columns of the papers. Brandeis, Theodore Brandeis, the violinist. The name sang in her ears. When she walked on Michigan Avenue during that last week, she would force herself to march straight on past Orchestra Hall, contenting herself with a furtive and oblique glance at the announcement board. The advance programs hung, a little bundle of them, suspended by a string, from a nail on the wall near the box office, so that ticket purchasers might rip one off and peruse the week's musical menu. Fanny longed to hear the comment of the little groups that were constantly forming and dispersing about the box office window. She never dreamed of allowing herself to hover near it. She thought sometimes of the woman in the businesslike gray skirt and the black sateen apron who had drudged so cheerfully in the little shop so that Theodore Brandeis's name might shine now from the very top of the program in heavy black letters. Soloist, Mr. Theodore Brandeis, violin. The injustice of it. Fanny had never ceased to rage at that. In the years to come, Theodore Brandeis was to have that adulation which the American public, temperamentally so cold, gives its favorite, once the ice of its reserve is thawed. He was to look down on that surging, tempestuous crowd which sometimes packs itself about the foot of the platform in Carnegie Hall, demanding more, after a generous concert is concluded. He had to learn to protect himself from those hysterical, enraptured, wholly feminine adorers who swarmed about him, scaling the platform itself. But of all this there was nothing on that Friday and Saturday in October. Orchestra Hall audiences are not, as a rule, wildly demonstrative. They were no exception. They listened attentively, appreciatively. They talked critically and favorably on the way home. They applauded generously. They behaved as an Orchestra Hall audience always behaves, and would behave even if it were confronted with a composite Elman Chrysler Ysaye soloist. Theodore's playing was, as a whole, perhaps the worst of his career. Not that he did not rise to magnificent heights at times, but it was what is known as uneven playing. He was torn emotionally, nervously, mentally. His playing showed it. Fanny, seated in the auditorium, her hands clasped tight, her heart hammering, had a sense of unreality as she waited for Theodore to appear from the little door at the left. He was to play after the intermission. Fanny had arrived late, with Theodore, that Friday afternoon. She felt she could not sit through the first part of the program. They waited together in the anteroom. Theodore, looking very slim and boyish in his frock coat, walked up and down, up and down. Fanny wanted to straighten his tie. She wanted to pick an imaginary thread off his lapel. She wanted to adjust the white flower in his buttonhole. He jerked it out presently, because it interfered with his violin, he said. She wanted to do any one of the foolish, futile things that would have served to relieve her own surcharged feelings. But she had learned control in these years, and she yielded to none of them. The things they said and did were, perhaps, almost ludicrous. "How do I look?" Theodore demanded, and stood up before her. "Beautiful," said Fanny, and meant it. Theodore passed a hand over his cheek. "Cut myself shaving, damn it." "It doesn't show." He resumed his pacing. Now and then he stopped, and rubbed his hands together with a motion we use in washing. Finally, "I wish you'd go out front," he said almost pettishly. Fanny rose without a word. She looked very handsome. Excitement had given her color. The pupils of her eyes were dilated, and they shone brilliantly. She looked at her brother. He stared at her. They swayed together. They kissed and clung together for a long moment. Then Fanny turned and walked swiftly away, and stumbled a little as she groped for the stairway. The bell in the foyer rang. The audience strolled to the auditorium. They lagged, Fanny thought. They crawled. She told herself that she must not allow her nerves to tease her like that. She looked about her with outward calm. Her eyes met Fenger's. He was seated alone. It was he who had got a subscription seat for her from a friend. She had said she preferred to be alone. She looked at him now, and he at her, and they did not nod nor smile. The house settled itself flutteringly. A man behind Fanny spoke. "Who's this Brandeis?" "I don't know. A new one. German, I guess. They say he's good. Chrysler's the boy who can play for me, though." The orchestra was seated now. Stock, the conductor, came out from the little side door. Behind him walked Theodore. There was a little, impersonal burst of applause. Stock mounted his conductor's platform and glanced paternally down at Theodore, who stood at the left, violin and bow in hand, bowing. The audience seemed to warm to his boyishness. They applauded again, and he bowed in a little series of jerky bobs that waggled his coat tails. Heels close together, knees close together, a German bow. And then a polite series of bobs addressed to Stock and his orchestra. Stock's long, slim hands poised in air. His fingertips seemed to draw from the men before him the first poignant strains of Theodore's concerto. Theodore stood, slim and straight. Fanny's face, lifted toward him, was a prayerful thing. Theodore suddenly jerked back the left lapel of his coat in a little movement Fanny remembered as typical in his boyish days, nuzzled his violin tenderly, and began to play. It's the most excruciating of instruments, the violin, or the most exquisite. I think Fanny actually heard very little of his playing. Her hands were icy, her cheeks were hot. The man before her was not Theodore Brandeis, the violinist, but Teddy, the bright-haired, knickered schoolboy who played to those people seated in the yellow wooden pews of the temple in Winnebago. The years seemed to fade away. He crouched over his violin to get the cello tones for which he was to become famous, and it was the same hunched, almost awkward pose that the boy had used. Fanny found herself watching his feet as he shifted his position. He was nervous, and he was not taken out of himself. She knew that because she saw the play of his muscles about the jawbone. It followed that he was not playing his best. She could not tell that from listening to him. Her music sense was dulled. She got it from these outward signs. The woman next to her was reading a program absorbedly, turning the pages regularly and with care. Fanny could have killed her with her two hands. She tried to listen detachedly. The music was familiar to her. Theodore had played it for her again and again. The last movement had never failed to shake her emotionally. It was the glorious and triumphant cry of a people tried and unafraid. She heard it now, unmoved. And then Theodore was bowing his little jerky bows, and he was shaking hands with Stock and with the first violin. He was gone. Fanny sat with her hands in her lap. The applause continued. Theodore appeared again, bowed. He bent very low now, with his arms hanging straight. There was something gracious and courtly about him, and foreign. He must keep that, Fanny thought. They like it. She saw him off again. More applause. Encores were against the house rules. She knew that. Then it meant they were pleased. He was to play again. A group of Hungarian dances this time. They were wild, gypsy things, rising to frenzy at times. He played them with spirit and poetry. To listen sent the blood singing through the veins. Fanny found herself thinking clearly and exaltedly. This is what my mother drudged for, and died for, and it was worth it. And you must do the same if necessary. Nothing else matters. What he needs now is luxury. He's worn out with fighting. Ease, peace, leisure. You've got to give them to him. It's no use, Fanny. You lose. In that moment she reached a mark in her spiritual career that she was to outdistance but once. Theodore was bowing again. Fanny had scarcely realized that he had finished. The concert was over. The group of dances, the man behind her was saying, as he helped the girl next to him with her coat. But I didn't like that first thing. Church music, not concert. Fanny found her way back to the anteroom. Theodore was talking to the conductor and one or two others. He looked tired, and his eyes found Fanny's with appeal and relief in them. She came over to him. There were introductions, congratulations. Fanny slipped her hand over his with a firm pressure. Come, dear, you must be tired. At the door they found Fenger waiting. Theodore received his well-worded congratulations with an ill-concealed scowl. My car's waiting, said Fenger. Won't you let me take you home? A warning pressure from Theodore. Thanks, no. We have a car. Theodore's very tired. I can quite believe that. Not tired, growled Theodore like a great boy. I'm hungry, starved. I never eat before playing. Kurt Stein, Theodore's manager, had been hovering over him solicitously. You must remember tomorrow night. I should advise you to rest now as quickly as possible. He, too, glared at Fenger. Fenger fell back almost humbly. I've great news for you. I must see you Sunday, after this is over. I'll telephone you. Don't try to come to work tomorrow. All this in a hurried aside to Fanny. Fanny nodded and moved away with Theodore. Theodore leaned back in the car, but there was no hint of relaxation. He was as tense and vibrant as one of his own violin strings. It went, didn't it? They're like clods, these American audiences. It was on the tip of Fanny's tongue to say that he had professed indifference to audiences, but she wisely refrained. Gad, I'm hungry. What makes this Fenger hang around so? I'm going to tell him to keep away some day, the way he stares at you. Let's go somewhere tonight, Fan, or have some people in. I can't sit about after I've played. Olga always used to have a supper party or something. All right, Ted, would you like to go to the theater? For the first time in her life she felt a little whisper of sympathy for the despised Olga. Perhaps, after all, she had not been wholly to blame. He was to leave Sunday morning for Cleveland, where he would play Monday. He had insisted on taking Mizzy with him, though Fanny had railed and stormed. Theodore had had his way. She's used to it. She likes to travel, don't you, Mizzy? You should have seen her in Russia, and all over Germany, and in Sweden. She's a better traveler than her dad. Saturday morning's papers were kind but cool. They used words such as promising, uneven, overambitious, gifted. Theodore crumbled the lot into a ball and hurled them across the room, swearing horribly. Then he smoothed them out, clipped them, and saved them carefully. His playing that night was tinged with bravado, and the Saturday evening audience rose to it. There was about his performance a glow, a spirit that had been lacking on the previous day. Inconsistently enough, he missed the antagonism of the European critics. He was puzzled and resentful. They hardly say a word about the meaning of the concerto. They accept it as a piece of music, Jewish in theme. It might as well have been entitled Springtime. This isn't France or Russia, said Fanny. Antagonism here isn't religious. It's personal, almost. You've been away so many years you've forgotten. They don't object to us as a sect or a race, but as a type. That's the trouble, Clarence Hale says. We're free to build as many synagogues as we like, and worship in them all day if we want to, but we don't want to. The struggle isn't racial anymore, but individual. For some reason or other, one flashy, loud-talking Hebrew in a restaurant can cause more ill feeling than 10,000 of them holding a religious mass meeting in Union Square. Theodore pondered a moment. Then here each one of us is responsible. Is that it? I suppose so. But look here. I've been here 10 weeks, and I've met your friends, and not one of them is a Jew. How's that? Fanny flushed a little. Oh, it just worked out that way. Theodore looked at her hard. You mean you worked it out that way? Yes. Fan, we're a couple of weaklings, both of us, to have sprung from a mother like ours. I don't know which is worse, my selfishness or yours. Then, at the hurt that showed in her face, he was all contrition. Forgive me, sis. You've been wonderful to me, and to Mizzy, and to all of us. I'm a good-for-nothing fiddler, that's all. You're the strong one. Fenger had telephoned her on Saturday. He and his wife were at their place in the country. Fanny was to take the train out there Sunday morning. She looked forward to it with a certain relief. The weather had turned unseasonably warm, as Chicago Octobers sometimes do. Up to the last moment she had tried to shake Theodore's determination to take Mizzy and Otti with him, but he was stubborn. I've got to have her, he said. Michael Fenger's voice over the telephone had been as vibrant with suppressed excitement as Michael Fenger's dry, hard tones could be. Fanny, it's done. Finished, he said. We had a meeting today. This is my last month with Haynes Cooper. But you can't mean it. Why, you are Haynes Cooper. How can they let you go? I can't tell you now. We'll go over it all tomorrow. I've new plans. They've bought me out, do you see? At a price that, well, I thought I'd got used to juggling millions at Haynes Cooper, but this surprised even me. Will you come? Early? Take the 8:10. That's too early. I'll get the 10. The mid-October country was a lovely thing. Fanny, with the strains of Theodore's debut and leave-taking behind her, and the prospect of a high-tension business talk with Fenger ahead, drank in the beauty of the wayside woods gratefully. Fenger met her at the station. She had never seen him so boyish, so exuberant. He almost pranced. "Hop in," he said. He had driven down in a runabout. "Brother get off all right?" "Gad, he can play! And you've made the whole thing possible." He turned to look at her. "You're a wonder." "In your present frame of mind and state of being," laughed Fanny, "you'd consider any one a wonder. You're so pleased with yourself, you're fairly gummy." Fenger laughed softly and sped the car on. They turned in at the gate. There was scarlet salvia now to take the place of the red geraniums. The gay awnings, too, were gone. "This is our last week," Fenger explained. "It's too cold out here for Katherine. We're moving into town to-morrow. We're more or less camping out here, with only the Jap to take care of us." "Don't apologize, please. I'm just grateful to be here after the week I've had. Let's have the news now." "We'll have lunch first. I'm afraid you'll have to excuse Katherine. She probably won't be down for lunch." The Jap had spread the luncheon table on the veranda, but a brisk lake breeze had sprung up, and he was busy now transferring his table from the porch to the dining room. "Would you have believed it," said Fenger, "when you left town? Good old lake. Mrs. Fenger coming down?" to the man. The Jap shook his head. "Nossa." Their talk at luncheon was all about Theodore and his future. Fenger said that what Theodore needed was a firm and guiding hand, a sort of combination manager and slave driver. An ambitious and intelligent wife would do it. That's what we all need, a woman to work for and to make us work. Fanny smiled. "Missy will have to be woman enough, I'm afraid. Poor Ted." They rose. "Now for the talk," said Fenger. But the telephone had sounded shrilly a moment before, and the omnipresent little Jap summoned Fenger. He was back in a minute, frowning. "It's Haynes. I'm sorry. I'm afraid it'll take a half-hour of telephoning. Don't you want to take a cat nap, or stroll down to the lake?" "Don't bother about me. I'll probably take a run outdoors." "Be back in half an hour." But when she returned he was still at the telephone. She got a book and stretched luxuriously among the cushions of one of the great lounging chairs, and fell asleep. When she awoke, Fenger was seated opposite her. He was not reading. He was not smoking. He evidently had been sitting there, looking at her. "Oh, gracious! Mouth open?" "No." Fanny fought down an impulse to look as cross as she felt. "What time? Why didn't you wake me?" The house was very quiet. She patted her hair deftly, straightened her collar. "Where's everybody? Isn't Mrs. Fenger down yet?" "No. Don't you want to hear about my plans now?" "Of course I do. That's what I came for. I don't see why you didn't tell me hours ago. You're as slow in action as a Chinese play. Out with it." Fenger got up and began to pace the floor, not excitedly, but with an air of repression. He looked very powerful and compelling, there in the low-ceilinged, luxurious room. "I'll make it brief. We met yesterday in Haynes's office. Of course we had discussed the thing before. You know that. Haynes knew that I'd never run the plant under the new conditions. Why, it would kill every efficiency rule I've ever made. Here I had trimmed that enormous plant down to fighting weight. There wasn't a useless inch or ounce about the whole enormous billionaire bulk of it. And then to have Haynes come along, with his burdensome notions and his socialistic slop. They'd cripple any business, no matter how great a start it had. I told him all that. We didn't waste much time on argument, though. We knew we'd never get together. In half an hour we were talking terms. You know my contract and the amount of stock I hold. Well, we threshed that out, and Haynes is settling for $2.5 million. He came to a stop before Fanny's chair. $2.5 million what?" asked Fanny feebly. "Dollars." He smiled rather grimly. "In a check." "One check?" "One check." Fanny digested that in her orderly mind. "I thought I was used to thinking in millions. But this! I'd like to touch the check just once." "You shall." He drew up a chair near her. "Now get this, Fanny. There's nothing that you and I can't do with $2.5 million. Nothing. We know this mail order game as no two people in the world know it, and it's in its infancy. I know the technical side of it. You know the human side of it. I tell you that in 5 years' time you and I can be a national power, not merely the heads of a prosperous mail order business, but figures in finance. See what's happened to Haynes Cooper in the last 5 years. Why, it's incredible. It's grotesque. And it's nothing to what you and I can do, working together. You know people, somehow. You've a genius for sensing their wants or feelings or emotions. I don't know just what it is. And I know facts. And we have 2,500,000, and I can make it nearly 3 millions to start with. Haynes 15 years ago had a couple of 100,000. In 5 years we can make the Haynes Cooper organization look as modern and competent as a Crossroads store. This isn't a dream. These are facts. You know how my mind works, like a cold chisel. I can see this whole country, and Europe too after the war, God, yes, stretched out before us like a patient before expert surgeons. You to attend to its heart, and I to its bones and ligaments. I can put you where no other woman has ever been. I've 100 new plans this minute, and 100 more waiting to be born. So have you. I tell you it's just a matter of buildings, of bricks and stone and machinery, and people to make the machinery go. Once we get those, and it's only a matter of months, we can accomplish things I daren't even dream of. What was Haynes Cooper 15 years ago? What was the North American Cloak and Suit Company? The Peter Johnston Stores of New York? Wells Kaiser? Nothing. They didn't exist. And this year Haynes Cooper is declaring a 25% dividend. Do you get what that means? But of course you do. That's the wonder of it. I never need explain things to you. You've a genius for understanding. Fanny had been sitting back in her chair, crouching almost, her eyes fixed upon the man's face, so terrible in its earnestness and indomitable strength. When he stopped talking now and stood looking down at her, she rose too, her eyes still on his face. She was twisting the fingers of one hand in the fingers of the other, in a frightened sort of way. "I'm not really a businesswoman. Wait a minute, please. I have a knack of knowing what people are thinking and wanting. But that isn't business." "It isn't, eh? It's the finest kind of business sense. It's the thing the bugs call psychology, and it's as necessary today as capital was yesterday. You can get along without the last. You can't without the first. One can be acquired. The other you've got to be born with." "But you know, of late, it's only the human side of it that has appealed to me. I don't know why. I seem to have lost interest in the actual mechanics of it." Fenger stood looking at her, his head lowered. A scarlet stripe that she had never noticed before seemed to stand out suddenly like a welt on his forehead. Then he came toward her. She raised her hand in a little futile gesture. She took an involuntary step backward, encountered the chair she had just left, and sank into it coweringly. She sat there, looking up at him, fascinated. His hand on the wing of the great chair was shaking. So, too, was his voice. "Fanny, Katherine's not here." Fanny still looked up at him, wordlessly. "Katherine left here yesterday. She's in town." Then at the look in her face. "She was here when I telephoned you yesterday. Late yesterday afternoon she had one of her fantastic notions. She insisted that she must go into town. It was too cold for her here, too damp, well, she went. And I let her go. And I didn't telephone you again. I wanted you to come." Fanny Brandeis, knowing him, must have felt a great qualm of terror and helplessness. But she was angry, too, a wholesome ingredient in a situation such as this. The thing she said and did now was inspired. She laughed, a little uncertainly, it is true, but still she laughed, and she said, in a matter-of-fact tone, "Well, I must say that's a rather shabby trick. Still, I suppose the tired businessman has got to have his little melodrama. What do I do? Beat my breast and howl, or pound on the door panel?" Fenger stood looking at her. "Don't laugh at me, Fanny." She stood up, still smiling. It was a rather brilliant piece of work. Fenger, taken out of himself though he was, still was artist enough to appreciate it. "Why not laugh," she said, "if I'm amused? And I am. Come now, Mr. Fenger, be serious, and let's get back to the billions. I want to catch the 5:15. "I am serious." "Well, if you expect me to play the hunted heroine, I'm sorry." She pointed an accusing finger at him. "I know now. You're quitting Haynes Cooper for the movies, and this is a rehearsal for a vampire film." "You nervy little devil, you!" He reached out with one great, irresistible hand and gripped her shoulder. "You wonderful, glorious girl!" The hand that gripped her shoulder swung her to him. She saw his face with veins she had never noticed before standing out, in knots, on his temples, and his eyes were fixed and queer. And he was talking rather incoherently and rapidly. He was saying the same thing over and over again. "I'm crazy about you. I've been looking for a woman like you all my life. I'm crazy about you. I'm crazy—" And then Fanny's fine composure and self-control fled, and she thought of her mother. She began to struggle, too, and to say, like any other girl, "Let me go! Let me go! You're hurting me! Let me go! You—" And then, quite clearly, from that part of her brain where it had been tucked away until she should need it, came Clarence Hale's whimsical bit of advice. Her mind released it now, complete. "If you double your fist this way, and tuck your thumb alongside like that, and aim for this spot, right here, about 2 inches this side of the chin, bringing your arm back and up quickly like a piston, the person you hit will go down limp. There's a nerve right here that communicates with the brain. The blow makes you see stars and bright lights." She went limp in his arms. She shut her eyes flutteringly. "All men like you have a yellow streak," she whispered, and opened her eyes and looked up at him, smiling a little. He relaxed his hold in surprise and relief. And with her eyes on that spot, barely 2 inches to the side of the chin, she brought her right arm down, slowly, slowly, fist doubled, and then up like a piston, snap! His teeth came together with a sharp little crack. His face, in that second, was a comic mask. Surprised, stunned, almost idiotic. Then he went down, as Clarence Hale had predicted, limp. Not with a crash, but slowly, crumpingly, so that he almost dragged her with him. Fanny stood looking down at him a moment. Then she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She walked out of the room and down the hall. She saw the little Jap dart suddenly back from a doorway, and she stamped her foot and said, "Scat!" as if he had been a rat. She gathered up her hat and bag from the hall table, and so out of the door and down the walk to the road. And then she began to run. She ran and ran and ran. It was a longish stretch to the pretty vine-covered station. She seemed unconscious of fatigue or distance. She must have been at least a half-hour on the way. When she reached the station, the ticket agent told her there was no train until 6. So she waited quietly. She put on her hat. She had carried it in her hand all the way, and patted her hair into place. When the train came, she found a seat quite alone, and sank into its corner, and rested her head against her open palm. It was not until then that she felt a stab of pain. She looked at her hand, and saw that the skin of her knuckles was bruised and bleeding. "Well, if this," she said to herself, "isn't the most idiotic thing that ever happened to a woman outside a near novel." She looked at her knuckles critically, as though the hand belonged to someone else. Then she smiled. And even as she smiled, a great lump came into her throat, and the bruise blurred before her eyes, and she was crying rackingly, relievedly, huddled there in her red plush corner. End of chapter 17.